Good morning, and welcome to Zicklin Talks Business. I'm Bruce Weber, Dean of the Zicklin School of Business. Thank you for joining us for this timely conversation on reputational risk, how it is created, how it spreads, and how organizations can manage it before it becomes a crisis. A strong reputation is often a company's most valuable asset, and yet also its most fragile. In an environment defined by tight regulation, instant social media amplification, operational complexity, and heightened public expectations, reputational problems rarely stay contained. A service outage, a data breach, a conduct failure, or even a misaligned incentive can escalate quickly into a financial, regulatory, and leadership crisis. Today, we'll explore how trust and credibility get built inside organizations and examine the drivers of reputational harm across industries. When things go wrong, does a strong reputation make an institution more resilient or simply give it more to lose? And how can leaders move beyond vague concerns about brand image to adopt early warning indicators, embed reputational risk into enterprise risk management, and strengthen accountability throughout their organizations? To help us unpack these questions, Larry Zicklin, graduate of Baruch, 1957, will lead a conversation with two distinguished faculty members from our Naranda Paul Lumba Department of Management. Professor Lauren Ide Liam and Professor Naomi Gardberg, their research and their teaching examine corporate governance, organizational trust, misconduct, and the systems that shape how firms respond to reputational threats. There will be time at the end of the session for questions from the audience, and you can submit them via Zoom's chat feature to my colleague and Associate Dean, Gwen Webb. Once again, our moderator is Larry Zicklin, former CEO and chairman of Neuberger Berman, and a valued member of our MBA and undergraduate honors faculty. Larry, let's begin.
Thank you, Bruce. I appreciate it. And welcome to our guests, Naomi and Lauren. So let me begin by asking the question, how do you define reputation? Is it more than image? Is it different than brand? How would you define it? Either one of you can take that.
Thank you, Larry. So these are all related concepts, but they each have a different place in how companies relate to their different stakeholders, their different publics. So let's start with brand, which is a key aspect. So a brand is a company's intended value proposition. It's forward-looking, and it can be characterized, it's aspirational, the symbols, the messaging. It's what we think about when we see a company's logo, for example. A reputation is more backward facing, right? It's collective held evaluations of a company's past actions and policies and what the company is promising for the future. So how reliable is the company? Can we trust the company? And of course, the reputation and the brand are highly related. We can think about image as something that's forward facing, outward facing, and more fleeting, for example, than reputation. So these are all related. Status is being a comparison of different companies. It's purely relational.
And I would also add trust into this conversation, right? So trust is also, but it's a little bit different than image and stuff like that, right? So trust is really about that relationship and that relational aspect that's like forward looking and the like willingness of the stakeholders to actually accept vulnerability on the part of the company, right? Like if I trust you, I can do that. And so it's an underlying element. But as Naomi points out, right, these are all inherently interconnected concepts.
In fact, trust is a necessary but not sufficient condition for a company to have a strong reputation.
And how do you develop trust with the consuming public? How does a company do that?
Well, it's about meeting their expectations, about consistency over time.
I'm sorry, Lauren.
I'm sorry, Larry. I was going to say, even the question, like you had asked us before, like who shapes trust and reputation? Like where do these things even come from? And I think what the really critical factor is, these are multi-stakeholder constructs. This is not something that the organization owns. This is not something that consumers own. It is owned by this interaction among the different internal and external actors, governance bodies, regulators, investors. media. So all of these kind of come together to influence reputation, built around these other constructs like, yeah, trust and engagement and brand and things like that.
There is some thinking that reputation lowers the cost of capital. Is there any evidence that that's true?
There are a number of studies that have been published in finance journals that demonstrate that companies with better reputations have a lower cost of capital, are more attractive employers. Companies with poor reputations tend to have to compensate their financial institutions more with higher interest rates, for example, and have a harder time hiring. So they spend more money on compensation.
And is trust and reputation a feature of hiring? Is there evidence that candidates will migrate to companies with higher reputations?
There is evidence that companies with strong reputations are more attractive employers. However, companies can compensate for that by
compensating.
compensation by paying higher salaries. And so, for example, if we look at the old Philip Morris Altria group, right, they paid more for their employees than a company like a Unilever or a Procter & Gamble.
And some of that comes from like why an employee might want to stay with an organization, right? And so on the one hand, if they're coming in to build their career, get the experience, then you can compensate them for that. If they're coming in because they are drawn to that organizational reputation and that idea of like the social embeddedness that comes and contributing to this multi-stakeholder identity concept, I guess, and the thing that is bigger than just the individual employee, you get a lot of people who are willing to give up money in exchange for social mission and things like that. I mean, that's why we can have nonprofits and things like that, but it's going to be very employee and organization specific.
And what do you teach your students about whether or not they should work for companies like Philip Morris, just to use that as an example?
We don't have many students who are interviewing for positions at Altria. I mean, I think our students, right, our largest employers are JP Morgan Chase and the accounting firms, right? And these are organizations that are based upon their integrity. We do not have accounting firms if people do not trust them and their the credibility that they lend to our whole financial system. That's really at the core of what we do.
Yeah, with our graduating seniors, I mean, I think they're all still coming out bright and shiny, and so they believe that the world can be a good place, and they believe that they want to make the world a better place, and they look for organizations where they can do that, and that's where reputation as an employer matters an awful lot. Now, where I see them sometimes get disillusioned is when they might come back and be like, well, they're not really practicing what they preach. And that is a big problem. And that gets back to that idea of this multi-stakeholder construct, right? So if they're presenting one thing to applicants, but another to employees, at some point that's going to catch up to the organization.
I'm sorry, Naomi, you were going to speak.
Oh, I was just going to say, I believe that is becoming harder for companies to do because of technology, because of Glassdoor and other online purveyors of data. So I do think it's harder for companies to promise one thing that they are not actually. That's not who they actually are.
Yeah, I mean, it's really the role of media in general and social media specifically in reshaping information asymmetries. I think has significantly altered how people even manage their or organizations can manage their reputation, or even individuals for that matter.
When reputations are created by management, particularly to create that good reputation, is that disingenuous in and of itself? Because they're out to create a good reputation, and what happens on the inside is wholly different.
Wow. So definitely leadership is a key aspect of building a strong reputation and protecting against reputational risks. But a company is not going to have a strong reputation unless it is embedded throughout the organization. It's not just what the executives are talking about, it's how the employees are carrying out their jobs, providing quality services and goods.
And I would respond also that the organization can't directly manages reputation. That is not something that's not like I am the person that manages the reputation. Like that's not something that organizations can do because it is something that is derived from these stakeholder interactions and engagement. And the media is definitely a very critically important stakeholder there. So if you're going to deal with things like how, again, the investors, employees, customers, the media, regulators, right? This is all going to work to create it. And like just the company alone is only one small part of being able to actually actively engage in it. They can definitely try. And, reputational management is something that all companies should do. But it is not something they can control. They can't just create it. It's like saying the same thing with org culture. You can't just create a culture. You can try, you can have initiatives, but it is not like I can pull this lever and this will happen with certainty.
But aren't we all occasionally shocked when a company turns out to have a feet of clay? I'm thinking of Boeing. Boeing had such a great reputation, and then they had these two crashes, and it turns out they were stinting on some of the parts, and they were accelerating how fast they developed planes, probably at the expense of safety. And suddenly, Boeing, to use the metaphor, goes down in flames.
Well, I think with Boeing, it's really interesting because Boeing is inherently not separable from its product. So Boeing and planes go hand in hand. And that can be different than other companies, right? Like J&J or something else where you can differentiate the brand or the company identity from the actual product. And I do agree that like, yeah, there's definitely time. And I think we're most shocked when it's a company that we had previously trusted and that we feel like our trust has somehow been violated. Perhaps because of the type of product or the actual, the nature of the wrongdoing, so to speak. Like I know Naomi has some stats on this, like loss of life and things like that create very different types of shock. So I'll let her.
Oh, well, thank you. So, I mean, part of the Boeing shock is also that the regulators were letting Boeing self-regulate and perform their own inspections. And so this took time for Boeing's successes to really unravel. And that made it that much more shocking to everyone.
When you talk about regulation, I'm reminded of a friend of mine that was the CEO of a Wall Street firm. And he always said that the employees were basically honest, but they were more honest if you look very carefully at them. And that was his line. But a company like Boeing, we trusted with our lives. We were passengers on their planes, and they violated that trust. But Boeing is too big to fail.
Yes.
How does that enter into this discussion where a company like Boeing is too big to fail because there's only two companies manufacturing these airplanes in the world, and one of them, Airbus, is got a backlog up to here.
Well, it definitely complicates the process of reputation serving as a check on corporate behavior, because even after the scandal, Boeing is still cannot keep up with its backlog of planes, right? It's still behind producing Dreamliners, for example. It is still behind in servicing its obligations to NASA in terms of our space exploration. So this does complicate. It's one of the reasons why antitrust regulation does have a place and protecting our society from wrongdoing.
Do we still have antitrust regulation? I haven't noticed it lately.
Theory.
Allegedly.
Do you think having a good reputation ameliorates the damage when something negative happens? Or does it depend on what kind of damage is created?
I think the answer is automatically, it depends. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so definitely having a strong reputation does give companies the benefit of the doubt. And because of the people's past experiences with the organization and the promise of the future. So if we think about Johnson & Johnson's first oops back in 2010 with the recall of the children's Motrin and Tylenol, it did harm the company's reputation. The company was no longer the top number one for reputation, but it still stayed around the top 10, the top 15 until we had the scandal or the recall with the talc and the baby powder, right? And people were much less likely to keep to trust.
Maintain their positive image, right?
Yeah,
Like,
to maintain
yeah.
it, because there had been these problems in the past, right? So reputation is a shield, but just like any shield, it can crack, it can be used up.
I think like early on, right? It was J&J's reputation was acting as this like buffer to what was going
Absolutely.
on, but you can only buffer oh so many times. And so it maybe buys you some time to figure out how you're going to respond. And that's probably one of the biggest benefits of having a good reputation is it can give you that
Exactly.
an organization that gap to be able to figure out what the problem is and how to address it. Um, but the more that you use it up, and particularly when it is a type of wrongdoing that is perhaps ambiguous may be the biggest problem where like if you can very clearly point to like, oh, this was the defined issue, but if it's more of a systemic issue or a broad-based thing or something that appears to involve like multi actors within an organization, that's where a corporate reputation is really not going to help you.
And when death is involved, companies often never recover their prior reputation. If the company is blamed for the death, it will take, decades for it to recover, even if it does. And often those companies are acquired.
And of course, their behavior after the disclosure is made, I think I remember Johnson & Johnson saying there was no talc in the baby powder. Then there was just a minute amount of talc in the baby powder. And the women that had the cervical cancer were doing something wrong with the talcum powder. And there was all kinds of excuses.
Right. Well, I think the question, talc is often mined where asbestos occurs. And so the question was there asbestos in the talc? And Johnson & Johnson said, we've run tests. There's no evidence that this happened. In fact, there is not conclusive scientific evidence at this point, but the case went to a jury trial and Johnson & Johnson lost class action lawsuit. So that's still, I'm actually not sure. I'll just say I'm not sure of the facts.
And would I be correct in assuming that reputation is even more critical in certain industries than others, and pharma being one of them? Accounting may be one of them, banking may be one of them. Is that true?
Yeah, so we can think about different goods and services, about how difficult it is to evaluate the quality, the safety of those products. So something like tennis shoes, right? That's an experience good. We know whether we like Asics or Nikes based upon on how well they fit and how fast we can run in them, right? So that's fairly easy to evaluate on one end, or whether a lipstick is our color. On the other end is something like financial services, especially insurance, right? Where it's even hard to evaluate after we buy the insurance and we might need it, right? So there's a range of how difficult it is for the consumer to evaluate the product. So on one hand are these credence goods like insurance, and on the other hand are experience goods that we can evaluate. And then somewhere in between are search goods, such as clothes, where we can look online and we can compare the prices and we can look at the fabric and those types of things. So that
When they take something like, sorry, but
no,
like
go ahead.
Boeing, right? Where like I, as a consumer, I don't know what makes a good airplane versus not. So even if like it's very much, I think, a credence good environment, even though it is a tangible thing that they make, because as the end consumer, I don't have any ability to evaluate the engineering quality. So I have to rely on other stakeholders, regulators, the airlines themselves, manufacturer reputation as a proxy for that. So in that sense, trust has to do a lot of the goods, right? A lot of the work there uh, in that kind of environment. And then you get Johnson & Johnson that's mixed, right? So some of the stuff, their consumer goods, right, might be a little bit more experience based. Like I take Tylenol because I know Tylenol works when I have a fever. But like think about even doctors, right? You go to the doctor. How do you know you have a good doctor?
Exactly.
Right? How do you know that the doctor says that this heart stent is going to fix your problems? But how do you know that is the case? You have to trust your doctor, and they're also then trusting another level of trust, right? They're trusting the
Right.
manufacturer of the stent.
And then if we think about insurance, and how difficult it is to assess insurance, we can also think about how much money the insurance industry is spending on branding, right, with their advertising, right? We want to avoid mayhem. We've got a really cute gecko. We can hang out with Flo and her colleagues, right? The money they're spending in branding is in part because it's so difficult for the public to assess their products and services and their reputation.
And I was thinking, Lauren, when you mentioned the doctors, that prompts doctors not to take on risky cases because they don't want to diminish their records.
Yeah.
So they only want to put stents in people that are 40 to 60 and not 80, because 80 is much more of a chance you're going to lose the patient.
I think that's pressure from the hospital, not necessarily the doctor.
Well,
Okay.
but if we're caring about the stats, I think yeah, I agree with you, Larry, that yeah, with coming out from that. But but it has to be because there is some kind of an internal mechanism that is telling these doctors they need to care about these statistics, which is there's a stakeholder coming in and saying, we care about this statistic. You are now obligated to comply and report these statistics. And if we have transparency in reporting, are people going to game the reporting?
I always
Same thing with
remember,
regulators, right? Boeing was supposed to regulate itself. Didn't do such a good job of that.
so that demonstrates that the regulatory aspects of our economy is enormous, and we should be spending a lot on regulation. I would think of that in the pharmaceutical industry with the FDA. I want this thing regulated. I want to know the pills I take are going to do what I think they're going to do.
Yeah, and that are safe. And because think about how much trust goes into you being able to take a pill, right?
Yeah.
You're going to trust that not only is going to treat what you have, but that nobody's contaminated it, that you got the right drug from the pharmacy to begin with. And there's, market-based measures that can try to fill in some of those gaps. I'm thinking very specifically like a very local scandal that I had in one of my Facebook mommy groups this week, where somebody got the wrong prescription. Right? She got to go fill a prescription. She got the wrong pill. And there are actually now websites where you can go in and say, my prescription is supposed to be whatever this drug is, and look up to make sure that the pill that you've got in that bottle matches what it's supposed to be from the regulators to make sure that you've got the right pill. But the fact that those like secondary mechanisms even exist means that there has been a reputational failure or a trust failure or a mistake, right? Because that was the genesis of these platforms existing.
Thank goodness for AI. Is maintaining a reputation more difficult these days because of the power of social media?
So we are studying that, right? This is the current research is looking at the role of social media and constructing reputation and constructing social approval. I have a project that's looking at fake news and how fake news can affect social evaluations of companies. There's some clear evidence that some individuals are more susceptible to fake news than others are. There's evidence that shows that people like to share fake news even if they know it's fake. And then the question is, what should companies do? Should companies react? Should they deny? And I currently have a study that is out in the field that looks at how companies should respond to fake news stories.
And there are plenty of fake news stories.
Yes.
Yes. But what's interesting is there's actually a smaller subset of companies that are the target of fake news than you would expect.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to revert back to Boeing for a second because something just occurred to me. Is reputation less important to them because they're too big to fail and they're going to have demand for their planes no matter what?
On one hand, yes, but I think on the other hand, if our regulatory bodies are working, they're going to spend more money on inspections and on regulations. They're going to have to argue why their planes are safe to the airlines, not just American airlines, right? Airlines from around the world. So it's definitely going to drive up their costs, even if they are too big to fail. And that, of course, has implications for investors.
I think where it gets also interesting is the perception of a consumer, though, because like if I go to book a plane ticket somewhere, I can't choose my aircraft. So some of what we might think of as like some of the secondary governance mechanisms, right, outside of the firm's control, where you like consumer boycotts could be something that could actually change firm behavior, but that's not a credible threat in the case of Boeing, because I can't choose that I'm going to fly a Boeing plane or not if I'm booking a plane ticket.
Right. But for buying gas, if I'm going to fill my car up, maybe I drive an extra block so that I don't refill at Exxon or BP.
Yeah, that's something you care about as a consumer. Yeah, you can put your money where your mouth is, so to speak.
And is there evidence that the public is putting its money where its mouth is?
Well, I think we can, there are a number of, well, first of all, it's hard to measure how successful consumer boycotts are, but the boycott against Target, for example, really is hurting the company's bottom line. Their sales have definitely diminished as the public is switching to other retailers, again, because there's so many different options, so many different places to
When the
buy.
switching costs are low, they can do that, right? Then it's a
Exactly.
credible threat. And that's where the consumer boycott becomes a credible threat. But in some industries, yeah, when they're too big to fail, it's not.
And if we
And do we know that the Target reduction in sales is because of the consumer boycott, because of these issues that Target faces?
I do think that there's evidence that it is working, or that people are avoiding Target and shopping at other places.
Business managements have fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders, but they have no obligation to create reputation. Is that the nub of the problem, that businesses or business managements are opportunistic within the law?
But the value of the reputation, though, is it's buffering from a reputational risk, right? So the value of reputation is that a company is a more attractive employer, that it is attractive to investors, that it's attractive to customers, that it's an attractive strategic alliance partner. The companies want to serve as a supplier because they trust them to pay their bills on time and to not have a scandal that will taint them. So the value of this intangible asset is how it shapes different relationships with the firm that either create opportunities or reduce costs.
And in that sense, it is helping shareholders, right? So if it's done right, it creates positive effects for the shareholders. And it's one of those times you get actual how often do you actually get stakeholder symbiosis when it goes well? So shareholders win, consumers win, firm wins, everybody wins. And then I think the other takeaway that I want to make sure we get in, right? Like something is almost always going to go wrong. Like no firm is perfect, no human is perfect. And if you have a positive reputation, that can set you up for better success when something inevitably, to some extent, does go wrong.
I'm thinking of things going wrong in the pollution area. Do firms get forgiven for polluting?
There's some really cool research there. Yeah, so it really depends. It's to some extent, it depends whether or not anybody believed they were clean to begin with. What people, I mean, one of my favorite papers talks about the fact that it matters less whether or not you actually polluted about whether or not you said you were polluting. Right. So you may have been dirty, but if you were dirty all along and you were transparent and honest about the fact that you were doing this, at least we get that you're in a dirty industry, but we still might have a trust in that company, as opposed to someone that says that they're doing one thing, but is actually doing something else. And that is where you get that disconnect, right? And the not practicing what you preach problem. And that, especially with social media, is really hard to hide these days.
So you're saying it's not the polluting, it's the lying about the polluting.
I mean, I think both matters, but yeah.
But I think, is lying less forgivable?
The cover-up is usually worse than the scandal.
Yep. To quote some jury trials. Do we note that the investing public and the consuming public are more cynical these days? And does that make creating and maintaining a reputation more difficult?
So there are some different elements to that. It's quite clear that the public does not like it when companies advertise their corporate philanthropy, right? It makes them cynical, and they think that the corporate philanthropy is just being instrumental and as part of a company's marketing and not sincerely caring about the community. So the value of reputation is that when companies are philanthropic, the public trusts that they are being authentic with what they are doing and not being cynical. And it reduces them being cynical.
I mean, we have so much more as consumers, or even as the investing public, we have so much more information at our
Yeah.
hands now. And I think there is a risk to thinking that consumers are going to be cynical. I honestly don't believe that people want to be cynical, right? I believe ultimately people want to trust. That's in our human nature to do that. But the big problem, of course, is when reputation versus authenticity are in tension with each other. And so if something goes badly and we want to make sure that we're going to go well, right? If it's not believed to be a true action, that the firm is not being authentic, that, yeah, whether it's because people don't trust it or don't believe it, that's where the core problem can be.
Well, and then there's the other piece of it, of the industry halo effects, right? A company can do absolutely everything right. It can have the right systems in place, the right compensation in place. But then if one of their competitors has a scandal that affects its reputation, it can hurt the reputation of the entire industry. And we can look at financial services as an example of where a few bad players, some rogue employees, have really affected the reputation of the entire industry.
Yeah.
In
We don't
banking,
trust banks anymore because of news and social media, and that information is widely available. And you see the stories, and everything can get amplified, right? So it becomes a bit of an echo chamber to some extent too.
how does reputation affect your own buying habits?
I shop at Costco. But I do that partly for the reason, not because I love Costco. But yeah, but like I think it does to some extent, right? Like there are stores that I will shop at, and there are stores that I will choose not to put my money towards. And sometimes you just can't, and you can't control that. And sometimes convenience does outweigh it. I mean, I'm a working mom, as is Naomi, right? So sometimes you just deal with it. But when you can, and to some extent, that makes you feel good as a consumer, knowing that you are, at least I feel like that way, living up to my values and putting my money where my mouth is.
Agreed.
Has anybody tried to put reputation on the balance sheet? If it's worth so much, why isn't it an asset on the balance sheet?
We put brand value on there.
In the UK, not in the United States.
Yeah, but
right? The UK has a whole industry of valuating brands. I talk about it in class. It's very cool. I mean, because when
goodwill.
right? Well, goodwill, but that's from M&A activity.
I know, but it's different. But it's like those are all trying to get at a similar idea.
Right. I mean, if we look at the value of intangible assets over time, especially in the United States, something like 85% of a company's market capitalization comes from its intangible assets as opposed to its property, plant, and equipment, right? So we know it's very important. And this group of intangible assets includes its brand, its patents, its trademarks, so all of this intellectual property. So we can try to tease it out in terms of the intangible assets that a company holds, but it's a challenge.
When something goes wrong in an industry, and the stock, let's take a banking industry, and one bank goes down 20%, and the other bank goes down 30%. The same overall problem.
Mm-hmm.
Does that have something to do with reputation, where the 10% differential is based on a faith in one company versus a lack of faith in the other?
Part of it depends on which company was the source of the scandal, whether it spanned more than one bank, for example. Was it just a rogue trader as opposed to something embedded in the system, right? So if we look at Wells Fargo, right, which is a prime
Bad incentive
example.
alignment across the organization. And it wasn't
Right.
just one bad actor, it was a systemic problem.
Mm-hmm. Right. So part of it is, what is the source of the scandal or the crisis that's affecting the reputation, and how do companies react to it? So what are their crisis communications and what steps they're taking? But I'll give an example, just comparing Wells Fargo and JP Morgan Chase. Before the Wells Fargo scandal became public, it actually had a higher reputation with the general public than JP Morgan Chase, according to the Harris poll.
I think it had a higher market value than JP Morgan Chase.
Right, in 2015. And since the crisis happened, it has had Wells Fargo has stayed near the bottom of the reputations in the financial services industry. Right now, it's out of the most visible reputations in the United States, 100 most visible reputations is at 96. And at the same period of time, JP Morgan Chase has slowly increased its reputation with the general public. So it is now 21 out of 100 according to Harris Axios poll, right? So that is astounding, looking at two companies not only cross paths, but JP Morgan Chase's consistent reputation building with the general public.
When scandals hit, the companies that recover, some recover quickly, some recover slowly, and some never recover. What's the difference? Why do some do it so quickly and others, it never happens? Or if it happens over an extended period of time.
I mean, accountability, I think, is number one. Number
Tell me what
two,
that means. What do you mean by accountability?
I mean, accepting what happened, right? I think saying, oh, no, that didn't really, like, the worst thing you can possibly do is pretend that a scandal didn't actually happen, right? Like, I think that's probably one of the biggest things, because then you're going to like damage your reputation and your trust even more. But being accountable, addressing the fact that, yeah, this may have happened, and showing then a systemic correction. So and a credible step towards fixing the root of the problem.
Excuse me, I just wanted to, I remember in the Boeing crash, the first crash, when Boeing said, pilot error has nothing to do with the plane. This pilot was inexperienced or whatever, and he moved it down when he should have moved it up, and blamed the pilot.
Exactly. Blaming somebody else.
They not only blamed the pilot, but there was also the idea that these were airlines from developing countries.
Right. You're quite right.
So they weren't maintained, they weren't trained, they weren't, and that's right. A lack of accountability, massively.
And so we can wonder if the scandal, the crisis would have unfolded differently if the first crashes had been with Air France or British, Airways or et cetera, right?
Which, to be clear, it totally could have been because they were flying the same planes. Like,
yes.
And they had the same instructions of what to do, and the instructions were wrong. Mm-hmm. Okay, but so you've got to own the fact that you have a problem. Yep. And when you say own, do you mean make it public, make a public apology and say, we're going to investigate this, but it's obviously our problem?
As a former lawyer, I do have to say that you're never going to be allowed by the lawyers to truly apologize per se, but you can talk about the structural steps you are creating so that it never happens again. Without admitting fault.
Yeah. I mean, and the other piece of it, remember, there is an industry of shareholder lawsuits, right? So if a company issues an apology, then there is a whole industry around suing, right? Creating a class action lawsuit. So companies are trying to balance these forces.
I mean, risk management covers both of them, right? So you got the litigation risk on one hand, and then you've got the reputation risk and the compliance risk on the other. And trying to balance those two to keep them in check is really hard in a situation like this. Like, I'm not saying it's easy to take accountability, but I think the worst thing you can do is blame somebody else.
And one of the companies I remember having a problem was Domino's Pizza. And in one of their press releases, they said, and the pizza isn't very good, and we're going to have to fix the pizza.
Insulting your core product. Yay. No, maybe not what I would do.
They just admitted it straight out and said, we're coming out with a whole new pizza, and it's going to look like this, that, and the other thing. And
but there were customers who liked Domino's Pizza, right? And so yes and no. I mean, that actually insulted the customers that they did have, the loyal customers who ordered their pizza regularly.
And would have kept doing it, would have backed them through a scandal.
Well, I guess the new pizza is selling more than the old pizza, or such as I would assume. So you've got to, just to go back to having a problem, you've got to own up to the problem.
Yep. Probably without admitting strict liability, but I think moving into immediately corrective actions and steps that are credible commitments, strategic in nature, right? I would say that they're not something that's going to just be accused of being any kind of woke washing, greenwashing, or lying.
Rewatching.
Yeah. So making sure that it is a credible commitment that addresses the root cause of the problem as perceived. And so that you have to figure out who you're trying to make happy. Are you trying to make consumers happy? Are you trying to make regulators happy? Because that may differentiate how you're going to respond. But I think there needs to be true corrective steps taken to address so that it never happens again. And it needs to be a credible communication that it is not going to happen again because we have done the following things to make sure, even if it is a bad actor, right? A rogue trader, we have now made sure that rogue traders can't do this anymore.
Exactly.
I remember when Jamie Dimon said a problem they were having overseas, this was the whale problem, was a small problem. Turned out to be $6 billion. It wasn't so small. And he learned a great lesson from that, I think. So you have to act. You have to act voluntarily before the regulators get to you. You have to make decisions quickly. I'm assuming, and Lauren, given your legal experience, I'm assuming that the first 72 hours, or maybe the first 48 hours, are critical when something happens. Is that fair?
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that, but I think some of these can take time, right? Like, I'm not going to say that it's only the first 48 matter. I think
No. I don't mean that.
Yeah.
But you have to say something very quickly. You just can't let time go on and hope it goes away.
Because then you're going to lose control of the story, right? Then media, right? We don't have the same kind of like, we can't operate in a vacuum anymore. You're going to have to assume that somebody is going to find out about it. So even if initially it's only a few people, how long can you actually reasonably keep something like that? Like nobody can keep a secret anymore. And so getting out ahead of it, I think, is what matters the most. And that may differ depending on what it is and, the actual nature of the incident. But yeah, the initial response, I think, is incredibly important. It should be swift. Now, swift may be different depending on the industry because it may take some time also to figure out, because this is assuming that organizations are omnipotent and able to act within 48 hours. 48 hours is not very long. For them to be able to figure out what happened. And that's where you can sometimes end up with, the straw man, right? We're going to sacrifice you on the platter of you're taking the fall for this without making credible commits within the organization. So there's almost a risk of operating too quickly, because if a firm comes out there and operates too quickly, it doesn't actually take the time to figure out what went wrong and what's going to fix it, right? That's going to look like lying, right? Oh, it happened because of this. And then it turns out it didn't actually happen because of that. That's lying. And that's going to damage trust. And once you've lost trust, you've definitely lost reputation.
And it depends on the nature of the crisis.
Yeah.
And it seems to me you have to change something. Something real has to occur, even for PR purposes. And that may mean that some executives have to change, because you have to make sure that this culture that created this doesn't exist anymore. And that means changing the people. Corporations don't do anything. People do things.
Right. So we often see executives resign. So the Volkswagen Dieselgate, right? The CEO of the corporation resigned, even though this problem did not happen in the C-suite, it happened in another part of the organization. But there's that symbolic action of taking responsibility.
I'm going to go back to what you said before about like trust being necessary but not sufficient, right? An executive taking responsibility for something may be necessary, but it's not in and of itself going to fix the entire problem. So you need, you don't want it to be a symbolic accountability mechanism, right? I'm going to go back and say we need credible structural change. So it's not enough just to change the executives. You're also got to change how the executives are operating or how business is being done. Because we don't want resignation to be, a substitute for reform, right? We want it to actually be part of the reform. And I think that's how you're going to also work towards rebuilding your reputation, by showing that you're taking this seriously and you're making credible actions towards making sure it never happens again.
I was thinking about that in relation to the Congress of the United States. We just noticed the two congressmen resigned. And I'm thinking to myself, when did Congress ever do an investigation into itself? Because these two congressmen can't be the only ones. There have to be others. And there's no investigation. There's nothing that goes on. And that's why people are so cynical about the Congress.
Yes.
Yes.
So leadership, I think you would agree, has to be transformed. And you've got to make sure that the old culture that produced this is no longer in power.
I think that depends really on the nature of the crisis, right? So Wells Fargo, I would say yes. Volkswagen Dieselgate, yes, this is throughout much of the organization. The scheme to put this together was actually quite sophisticated, but there could be other instances where it's not necessary to change the culture of the organization, where there really was a rogue employee, a bad apple. And once that person is removed and systems are put in place to make sure that that doesn't happen again, right?
So beefing up, your reporting systems, your structural systems, again, not so much the initial corrective action, but also the systems in place so it doesn't happen again. I think that's really critical. And along with making sure that doesn't happen again, making sure that you have the reporting systems in place and the compliance and governance structures to know if something else is going to happen or something related is going to happen, right? So you're trying to come in and make sure that you have a good culture, a good speak up culture where because employees are going to be the ones that are going to know most of the time, right? So making sure that it's safe for employees to report wrongdoing, making sure that they feel that their reports are going to be taken seriously. And so there is going to be a lot of, perhaps, again, depending on the nature of the crisis, right, reputation rebuilding, even with your internal stakeholders, to make sure that people are feeling like the cultural change has actually happened, both internally as well as externally.
I'm thinking again of Wells Fargo, which to me is the pinnacle of this kind of stuff, where these accounts, just to remind some young people that may not remember it, that there were accounts opened up all over the place without consulting the account holder. They would simply open up a second account, take $25 from one account, put it in the other account, and now you had two accounts instead of one. And there were thousands and thousands of accounts that were open, tens of thousands of accounts that were open. And what they did was initially, they fired all the $10 and $12 an hour tellers that were opening these accounts, and paid no attention to the senior executives who were demanding these accounts be opened. Because as Senator Warren, when she had the CEO, I think his name was Stumpf, on the stand before the Senate, said 8 rhymes with great, and everybody had to have 8 accounts with Wells Fargo, even if they didn't need it. And they blamed other, and the same thing was true in Purdue Pharmaceuticals. I'm just reading a book about Purdue, where 3 people took the brunt of the problem, and the company paid them off afterwards to reimburse them for anything, and paid their fines and did all that kind of stuff.
But without making credible commitments to structural change. Yeah.
And not taking responsibility.
Yep.
I will note that I went to the Met a few weeks ago, and the Sackler name is no longer in the Egypt exhibit, even though they donated those funds before the crisis. So it's fascinating, actually, how it's tarnished that family and all of the good works they did before the crisis.
Well, if you read the book I'm reading, they deserve it. Have you ever been part of a reputational or business problem failure like this? I'm wondering, what is the conversation in the room when they're figuring this out? Do you have any idea what it's like? Or you've been told that by participants?
I am fortunate that I have not been employed by an organization that went through a crisis like this.
And I have attorney-client privilege. So. But I would say from what we've seen, I think in studies and what we've seen with interviews and other people, right? A lot of the time, they want to look for the easy and fast fix. And what appears to be the easy, fast fix is, fire the tellers. That's easy, that's visible, it's tangible. But did it actually address the root cause of the problem? Right. And that's where that's the hard work that comes when you have a scandal like this, is like, and those are the conversations that people don't want to have because they're uncomfortable and nobody wants to be examined for like having made either actively made, or it's not a mistake if you actually made it. So engaged in wrongdoing actively versus finding out that maybe you were just passively engaged and you didn't know. And that can make leaders very uncomfortable, and the right leaders will stand up and be accountable towards it.
Your compensation was dependent on opening new accounts. So you found a way to open new accounts.
Exactly.
And that's a structural failure. That was not the individual wrongdoing of the tellers.
Gwen.
Yes.
Questions.
Got some questions.
We have quite a few questions here. I'm going to read one from one of Naomi's students, and he says he's building on Naomi Gartberg's course, Management 4999, Strategic Management Concepts. And I guess the group project last semester was on Netflix. So the question is, how can organizations like Netflix align long-term competitive strategy and governance decisions to mitigate reputational risk and prevent user cynicism?
Well, I believe that came from Vincent. Hi, Vincent. Right. So Netflix.
I'm not sure that was the student.
Oh, a different student. Okay. So that's even better.
Might have been.
Right. So, I mean, Netflix is interesting. All the streaming services are interesting because they have a wide amount of content. Some of that content can be considered offensive to some audiences. I believe Netflix is one of the organizations that had this situation. When Disney moved out beyond into our movies, right, that was very controversial, right? So trying to balance the business case of growing your audience and your sales with maintaining your values is a challenge that many companies face. And I think, part of it is listening to audiences, listening to employees to understand how to maintain reputation and expectations.
And having some of those systems in place, right? If you have a portal where customers can make complaints, but nobody's actually going through them to see what they are, then that's not creating that accountability at the organizational level, and that's not letting them actually address like these stakeholder concerns. And at some point, it may build up if you're not being aware of that. So making sure that if you are, for example, collecting data, don't just collect the data, use the data, analyze the data, and take steps with the data.
Well, part of that is having the appropriate systems, right? If we go back to Ford with the rollover situation 2 decades ago, right? There were rollovers in Venezuela, there were rollovers in Texas, and there were rollovers in Saudi Arabia. But Ford's data was not integrated. It wasn't flowing together into Detroit. So the different managers did not know that the exact situation was happening in places with certain climates, right? It took much longer to solve the problem because they did not collect the information and analyze it.
Yeah. So eliminating some of those data silos can be really critical. Like not only, but you got to make sure that you're, getting that organizational visibility from the managers, right? The executive suite needs to be coordinating those things.
And just go back to Netflix, right? Some of these organizations, the streaming services, have had employees that were unhappy, right? Employees are a very important stakeholder. And so a company does have to decide how they want to listening to their employees, or employees able to switch into a different part of the organization. Are they going to suggest that employees that don't fit those values leave and go to another organization, right? And that is at the highest parts of the organization in the suite.
And what happens when there's competing stakeholder demands, right? If the shareholders are demanding profits above all else, and you have some unhappy employees, you have to decide, right? Which one do we maximize? I would argue from the human capital perspective, right? Happy employees make shareholders more money, so it's better to pay attention there. But that is not necessarily a universal given depending on what's going on. And it's on leadership to navigate these competing demands.
I think we can go on to the next question, also from a former student. In your experience, which governance mechanisms, such as board oversight, risk escalation procedures, or independent audits, are most effective in preventing such reputational risks from escalating into irreversible trust failures?
I think the most important is internally. I think your first obligation is to your own organization and figuring out what is going on. I think the secondary control mechanisms like, external audits and things like that are good and valuable, and they serve a need. But if we were doing the job right internally in the first place, we don't need them.
Right. If we're doing the job properly and we're preventing corruption and bribery in our organization, then we're not going to be violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
A related question, actually very closely related to this, is what groups within the organization, if any, have primary responsibility for creating a strong culture? Is it board, or is it much more widespread throughout the organization?
Significantly more widespread.
right? And
Not just the board.
Not just
Right.
the board, no.
Right. And we can't underestimate the importance of the leadership of the organization, but also the human resources. And I say this as the academic director of the executive MS in human resource management, right? That it is HR that is recruiting employees, compensating employees, recognizing employees. That is a core element of organizational culture.
Yeah. Selecting people within that and shaping the attitudes and values. And then I think leadership needs to be accountable, right? I think one of the worst things that leadership can do is not practice what they preach, because the employees are going to catch on immediately. And that is how you're going to damage the culture. And then that's going to feed out into other problems.
I just have to tell you something else. In my history of managing, which was extended, the one mistake I made among others, was being seduced by people who could bring a lot of business and were bad actors.
Oh,
I had that happen to me on a couple of occasions, and I always rooted.
I mean, I think what you're kind of getting at, Larry, is that cultural fit, organizational fit really matters. And to Naomi's point, right, from an HR perspective, if you're selecting the right people to begin with and you have appropriate training and things like that in place so that people are brought into the organization and taught the way that the leaders want the company to run, then you're going to create a self-sustaining culture. Can become self-sustaining at some point where it's going to have all these nice reinforcing boundaries. And in a perfect world, employees police themselves. And you don't even have to have, right? But we're rarely in a perfect world. But in theory, it would happen.
And you can be seduced by the bottom line.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. And I think if, again, I have research on Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, corruption and bribery, and this is often the case, right? Where there's an opportunity that is difficult to resist.
It looks so good on paper.
I think we have time for just one last question, of which there are many. So I thank the audience. It's been a very intensively discussed comment in the topic in the comments here. Someone is asking if you, Naomi, and Lauren could talk about your experience or guidance with regard to digital reputations. Are they different than other reputations? Are they something that the company should really, really be focusing to work on and develop and strengthen?
I think two halves of a whole, but the digital ones can live forever. And that's a message that also resonates with individual employees as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think digital reputation is distinct from other reputation. I think it's definitely a piece of it. What we have online can be very fleeting. It can be more of a approval, social approval or disapproval. But once messages are posted, they're basically there forever.
I think that's it. But Larry, do you have any last words?
I take out of this conversation, among other things, that it seems to me that what has been said, among other things, is that sins of incompetence may be forgivable, but sins of character are not.
Yeah. I think it's a very accurate statement.
I think that that's a very good place for us to leave it. I want to thank you, Larry. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Naomi, for a really intriguing discussion, which generated a lot of comment in chat. I'd like to mention to our audience that our May 12th webinar is on investing in distressed and bankrupt companies. So that will be very interesting. The guest will be Dov Gertzlin, management principal of DG Capital Management. He's a graduate of the Zicklin School, and Billy Organic, a professor in the Zicklin's law department. Thank you again, Larry, Lauren, and Naomi.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you,
Take
Gwen.
care,
Thank you,
everybody.
Larry.
A pleasure. Pleasure.